this working? How you guys doing?
Good.
Nathan, I just made you host.
Oh, thank
You
you.
have full control.
Great. Okay. '21. Okay.
It's 12:30. I just have one announcement that I want to make. Tomorrow we will meet in lab, so be in lab at 7:45. Our main goal tomorrow is going to be to get as much data collection as we can get done so that we can say goodbye to data collection and move on to analyzing data and putting together research report and all that stuff. So that's not what is on schedule in the schedule. We haven't gotten around to updating that yet. I'm working on that today, but definitely meet in lab 7:45 in your groups and be working on data collection.
Right. Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started unless anyone has any questions about lab. We'll have some similar announcements via email for the Thursday group. Okay, so today we're starting sort of a new unit that Dr. Kwinski introduced to you last week. Our next case study that we're going to be focused on is the Veen et al. Study that you should be able to find on Moodle. But we're going to take this time to give you guys some background information, some big picture information that'll make it easier to understand what's going on in that paper and why. So this is our introduction to the Kanza Prairie.
Dr. Judd?
Yeah.
There's two different PowerPoints on Moodle. Are they both the same thing?
Oh, I updated one of them because there was a typo. They should otherwise be the same thing. Let me see here. I thought I replaced it, but maybe I did not do that. Easy to check. Yeah, choose the second one. I'll just delete the first one. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so what we're going to dive into today is we're going to start introducing you all to some prairie organisms. Usually we'll do a grass, a forb, and an animal, just to give you guys some sort of specifics, right? To actually teach you about organisms and not just the concepts that we think about when we study them. We're going to give you some background on the landforms, sort of the geologic history of the Kanza Prairie region. And then we're going to focus on some components of ecosystem structure and function. So we'll talk about what we mean by ecosystem structure and function. And the three big things that we'll focus on within this sort of broad umbrella of ecosystem structure and function is the diversity of organisms, both the plants, the producers, and the grazers like bison. Diversity of organisms, climate, and fire, and the role of fire in the prairie. In order to, as we think about climate, you guys get a good idea of of how Earth's climate is controlled. We're going to introduce you to these Walter Leith climate diagrams that we'd like you to be able to read and interpret. And then finally, we're going to come to this concept of heterogeneity, which will be linked to the concept of scale. Scale is really important in ecology. Different patterns and processes operate at different scales, and certain patterns kind of emerge only when you look at certain scales. And heterogeneity is one of those patterns that can look different at different scales. So we'll talk about exactly what all that means. So some organisms. The first one, this is our prairie grass of the day. This is big blue stem, or Andropogon girardii. Notice we've got the genus is Andropogon, and the species, the specific epithet is girardii, so the whole species is A. girardii. Often you'll see scientific names are followed by another name that's not italicized. In this case, it's Wittmann. Wittmann is the name of the botanist who described the species Andropogon girardii. This name is called the authority. So this is the typical format for a species, a genus, an epithet. They're both italicized. Notice the epithet is lowercase. And then the first time you use a species name in a paper, you often will see the authority, but then afterwards you don't have to put the name of the person every time. The organism is a grass, usually 6 to 8 feet tall. All grasses are a member of the family Poaceae. Anytime you see a family name end in ACEAE, it means it's a plant family. We try to keep the Latin consistent. They're pretty distinctive. They have these sort of purplish or burgundy leaves and stems, and sometimes or frequently the inflorescence has these 3 branches, these 3 spikes, and that's what gives it that kind of turkey's foot look that makes it so easy to recognize. There can be 2 or 4 or 5 spikes, but 3 is pretty common, and it gives you that turkey foot look that makes it easy to recognize. You can also recognize it because where the blade of grass departs from the stem, where the leaf sheath transitions to the blade right here, if you can see my mouse, it's often quite hairy. So hairs at the nodes where the leaf blade diverges is typical of Andropogon. So burgundy, 3 spikes, hairy nodes. This is a really important grass in the prairie because it has rhizomes or underground stems that help the plant spread, but also kind of stabilize the soil and help hold in moisture, and especially in loose sandy soils, it's good for stabilizing the soil. So when you have a nice bed of stabilized soil from the roots and rhizomes and grasses and other plants, we call that sod. So this is sometimes called a good sod forming grass. And last thing we'll say is it's also a C4 grass. We'll have a whole day where we talk about exactly what that means. But basically, it's a kind of grass that can do rather well during times of water stress and high temperature. So it does well in warm seasons when there's a lot of evaporation. So we call it a warm season grass. So that's our grass of the day. Now, a forb is basically any plant that's an herb and not a grass. So it can't be a shrub, it can't be a tree, and it can't be a grass. But it's a broad-leafed, usually flowering plant. We call that a forb. And you guys have been dealing with a forb in lab all semester. Solidago is the genus for goldenrod. This is a different genus, Retibda, in the same family. It's also in the Asteraceae. So it has that sort of sunflower look to it. This is that typical head or capitulum in the sunflower family. You also saw these out of the sanctuary, at least early on. They have nice, bright yellow petals, and the capitulum, or the receptacle where the seeds are inserted here, so this is going to become the fruiting head here, is sort of enlarged and dome-shaped, and it's called the gray-headed coneflower because right now, if you go out and find it, the petals are all gone, it's going to seed, but there's this nice gray seed head sticking up where the rest of the plant has senesced away. That gives it the name the gray-headed coneflower. And it's a perennial herb or perennial forb, meaning it comes back from the same rootstock year after year. If something isn't a perennial, it's usually an annual or a biennial, which means that it has to grow from seed new every year for an annual or every 2 years for a biennial. This one's a perennial, so the same rootstock will come back year after year and produce new shoots and new flowers. So know the difference between a grass and a forb. And hopefully you all learn a bit about our prairie animal of the day, the American bison. This is kind of a good spot to tell you all about the difference between systematics and taxonomy, because you might have had a little bit of challenge with one of the questions on the homework. At least I've seen people struggle with it in the past. One of the questions was who described the species of the American bison. And the story of how we got the name bison is actually kind of a good way to describe these two things. So systematics is the branch of biology where we are interested in the relationships among organisms, their evolutionary histories. And ideally, we would classify organisms based on their sort of genealogy, their evolutionary history, instead of based on something else, like their color or where they live in the world, their geography, right? There are lots of ways you could group organisms together. And we look for a natural system that's based on the intrinsic evolutionary history of the organisms themselves. So that's what systematics is. Taxonomy is how we name things. And we have some rules for how we name things. I've already told you about a couple of them. We always have species are written as a binomial, in this case, bison, and there's an authority. We also group species into genera and genera into families and families into orders and so forth. Maybe you all have heard of the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species hierarchy from before, from an earlier biology class. But the history of how we got to bison is kind of fun. Obviously, people had been interacting with bison since the Americas were first colonized some 13,000 years ago. But when European colonists arrived, Allen in 1876 wrote up a little description of bison and collected a specimen in Kansas. And that specimen was taken to Europe, where Linnaeus, or more likely one of his students actually, established the name bison, the species epithet, the specific epithet bison, based on the animal that they studied. And they put it in the genus Bos, which is the genus for cows. Later in 1827, the name Bos bison was described by Linnaeus in 1758. But I flipped this around. Anyway, let me just tell you what's going on here instead of trying to follow the points. So then bison is the name we use today. Bos bison was the name that Linnaeus gave it because he put it in the genus Bos with cattle. Later, people decided that these things are not so cow-like that they shouldn't get their own group. So they created this subgenus bison within Bos. And then later in 1849, someone decided, look, bison are one thing and cows are another. So let's make two different genera, a bison genus and a cow genus for Bos. But it turns out that once we were able to use genetic sequence data to look at how similar these different species are to each other, it was found that bison, shown here, is closely related to other members in other species that we call cows that are in the genus Bos. And there's another species that's typically put in the bison genus that's native to Europe, native to Belarus and Poland, sort of Eastern Europe, Bison bonasus. But it turns out that these two bison species are kind of nested within a group that includes several different species of cattle, basically. So really, if you want to have one name for all of the things descended from this common ancestor of all cows, then really bison should be in the genus Bos. And sometimes you'll see that in scientific papers. But bison are so iconic to North America. They're an important part of our prairie and our history of the West, and important part of conservation efforts, that we typically just stick with the genus bison, even though genetic evidence suggests that it's just another kind of a cow. Does that make sense? It's just another kind of a cow within this cow group. And most cows are in the genus Bos, but we've preserved bison because we like it. And it's useful for conservation efforts.
Hey, Nathan.
Yeah.
It's interesting that bison is the sister taxon of Bosgromicus.
Yeah.
Because that's the yak. And the yak really is a lot less similar to bison, and bison bonasus than they are to one another. So is this a molecular phylogeny that you pulled up?
This is a molecular phylogeny, and I wouldn't put a lot of stake in it. What you'll notice here is that these branches that go between the different groups are pretty short.
Yeah.
They've been scaled to time. So if you got rid of that time scale, they'd be even shorter. So if you were to look up another phylogeny of another evolutionary tree of cattle and their relatives, you would probably see a similar pattern. One group of bison and Bos, but they might not have exactly the same relationships within this clade.
Yeah, so I present a phylogeny to my ecology of food students on the domesticated hoof stock. And it has bison and the yak all in the same clade, and they're a sister group to the modern cattle, Bos taurus and Bos indicus. But once again, the ordering within those has the two bison being sister groups, and then Bos granicus is ancestral to those. So this also illustrates the idea that, I'm sure you didn't plan this, but depending on what data you're looking at, you can reach different conclusions simply because of the different methodologies that are involved in generating that particular phylogeny, that particular evolutionary tree.
And those of you who take Biological Diversity 134 next semester will get practice doing that. You'll see how different data sets can give you similar but slightly different answers, and you can use those to kind of evaluate hypotheses about evolutionary relationships.
A friend of mine from grad school always stressed the idea that every phylogeny that you ever see is a hypothesis.
Yes, yeah. In fact, I usually say that the way I teach it in 134 is that every tree you see is a set of interrelated hypotheses based on the data that you have. Yeah. So we'll talk in more detail about bison in just a few minutes as we get into bison as one of the important grazers in Kanza Prairie. So we'll talk about some of their behaviors and things you learned about during your homework. This is a picture of what the Flint Hills region looks like, where Kanza Prairie is. So Kanza Prairie is a long-term ecological research station. That means it's a facility that is operated by Kansas State University. It's been funded by the National Science Foundation since 1980. And their focus is on studying the effects of fire, grazing, and climate on the prairie and on grasslands in general. Their projects involve studies of individual organisms and how they operate in the prairie, populations of organisms and how they change and fluctuate through time, how they grow and shrink, how the different species interact to comprise the community, and also how the ecosystem functions, how nutrients and energy flow through the system. And the idea here is to operate at a variety of scales, from studying small plots to entire watersheds or comparing across watersheds, and to study these things over long periods of time, maybe a season for certain studies, but maybe over 20 or 30 years or longer for other studies. So you get the opportunity to answer a lot of different questions and have those answers interrelate with each other. There are several long-term ecological research study sites around the world. Kanza is one of the originals funded by the NSF when these things got started in the 1980s. The Kanza Prairie area is about 3,400 acres, or sorry, 3,400 hectares. So what's a hectare? Maybe you don't think in hectares. That's all right. I don't really either. It's, let's see, 2.5, something like more than 8,000 football fields. So it's a big area. It's a really big area where they can divide up the landscape by watershed and study the different regions and different scenarios or treatments. What do you notice about the landscape at Kanza? A couple pictures here. What does it look like? What does the landform look like?
Like rolling hills with mostly grass.
Yeah, good. It's called the Flint Hills because it's got these nice smooth slopes and valleys. What else do you notice? Is it rolling? When I think of rolling hills, I think of it being a little more rounded than it is. Let's look here again. What do you notice about that landscape? Or the horizon?
The horizon's really flat.
Yeah, good. So what you have is a flat landscape that's dissected by these streams that create the valleys and give you that impression of the hills. Down in the valleys, where the water flows, you can see that it's not just grass, right? There's some woody growth. There's trees and shrubs that grow in the valley where water availability is higher. The look of this landscape is a function of the geologic history. So if you could sort of take a cross section of the landscape in the Flint Hills region, which is shown here in Kansas, this is where Kanza Prairie is, near the F in Flint Hills, you would see that there are alternating layers of rock, layers of limestone separated by layers of shale. And within the limestone, which is basically mud that's formed at the bottom of an ocean by the activity of organisms that produce calcium carbonate shells, when that mud made of the shells and other calcium carbonate producing organisms formed, sometimes there were voids. And in those voids in the mud, maybe a pocket where a shell was or something like that, you would get the formation of flint, which is just a chert. It's a microsilica or microcrystalline silica rock, really hard, really useful for making tools. It breaks and has nice sharp edges. So the flint that erodes out of the hillsides here as the limestone is weathered away by rain, which often has a slightly acidic pH to it, the flint remains where the limestone erodes away, and Native Americans often use this flint to make tools. And it's really abundant. The flint rocks in the soil make it kind of hard to till the soil for agriculture, so it really wasn't ever farmed. And that's part of why it's a prairie that's worth studying today. It was never farmed, never tilled, so we can look at the effect of climate and grazing and fire on a native prairie, an undisturbed or an untilled prairie ecosystem. The rolling hills and valleys are formed because the shale erodes more quickly than the limestone. And so that's what gives you these flat tops where the limestone is, and then the sloping hills under and below the soil on the sloping hills is where you would find the shale. The reason you get limestone and shale in different places depends on the depth of ocean water. When this was all under an ocean about 300 million years ago. So this is a map of what the world looked like, or at least what North America looked like during the early Permian, something like 290 million years ago or so. In this case, Texas is highlighted, but here's Kansas. And this is the seaway, a shallow interior seaway in North America where shale and limestone and other marine deposits were being laid down. So at the time, Kansas was in a depositional environment. Sediment was accumulating and building up and stacking these layers, such that older layers are on bottom and younger layers are on top. Today, it's a very different scenario. Today, Kansas is an erosional environment, meaning that as these streams work their way down through the Flint Hills, they're carrying away the shale and the limestone that gets weathered by the rainwater, and eventually depositing that stuff out in the Gulf of Mexico. So you can always divide the world into an erosional environment or a depositional environment, places where sediment is being accumulated or being taken away by weathering. Today, the Kanza Prairie is no longer a seaway. Obviously, it's one of the grasslands of the world. So this is a map showing where in the world you can find grasslands, places that aren't deserts. They're wet enough so that they're not deserts, and they're not forests. They're too dry and have too much fire usually to support widespread trees. In the middle there, you get grasslands. Grasslands get lots of different names. In North America, we call them prairies, but in South America, they call them the pampas. In Australia and parts of northern South America and in Africa, we often call them savannas. Across Eurasia up here, much of this is what we call the steppe, but they all are different kinds of grassland environments. And grasslands are one of the most ecologically threatened environments in the world because they're usually transformed for agriculture. So it's not native plants in most of the grasslands. It's either farms or it's cows and horses grazing the land, or sheep also as well. So this map just shows you the kind of the relative threat to the native ecosystems for the grasslands of the world. And you can see that here in North America, it's all dark red because it's almost all converted to agriculture. Something like less than 5% of our native prairie remains in the Great Plains region of North America. This is just a slide I had to highlight, not only that it's one of the most threatened areas because it's been converted to agriculture, but a very small proportion of grasslands around the world are protected from further development. But they're really important and diverse. We usually think about tropical rainforests, we think about high diversity of ecosystems, but there's a small patch of native prairie down in Dade County, Missouri, south of here, and it holds a state record with 46 native plant species in less than 1 square meter. So in a small plot that's basically a 1/4 meter square, there are 46 plant species all growing there together. That's really high species density. Of course, you can't get that in the tropical rainforest because the plants are all enormous trees, or at least many of them are. In this case, it's mostly forbs and grasses. This is a map showing the tallgrass prairies of North America, and this is that Flint Hills region where we have remnant or untilled prairie. And you can see that there's not a whole lot of this remnant prairie in other states like Iowa and Missouri and Illinois. Right, so we're going to think about ecosystem structure and function, and I'd like to sort of introduce you to this hierarchy that your textbook uses. We can organize ecological topics and ecological studies into this sort of a hierarchy where you might study organisms and their properties. You might study populations of organisms, so all the individuals of a single species in a given area, or those populations might interact within a defined region, and we call those interacting populations of organisms the community. And then if you include, in addition to all those organisms, those populations of organisms, some of the abiotic components of the ecosystem, say the climate and who's eating who, and how nutrients move from one population to another, how energy flows through the system. When you put all of that together, you get what we call the ecosystem. So organisms are parts of populations, populations are parts of communities, and when you include sort of the big picture abiotic as well as biotic components of a community, then you get the ecosystem. What's important about hierarchies like this is that it's often difficult to know a whole lot about an organism just from information you might have about the community. Or just because you know something about a population doesn't mean you know a whole lot about the ecosystem. So any one level relates very closely to adjacent levels above and below it, but each one also has sort of emergent properties that you wouldn't necessarily be able to predict just from studying the level below. So just from knowing something about an organism and its birth rates, you might not know a whole lot about the carrying capacity of that population. And just because you know something about the carrying capacity of a population, you might not know a whole lot about how climate influences that population over time. So this nestedness and sort of close relationships between adjacent levels of the hierarchy is a recurring phenomenon a recurring pattern, I should say, in ecology. So what do I mean by structure and function? Well, ecosystem structure you can divide into two basic categories: the biotic components of an ecosystem and the abiotic components of an ecosystem. We're going to be talking quite a bit about these two: the number of species in an ecosystem or a community, called species richness, and the abundance of individuals in those species, which is a component of diversity. Other aspects of biotic structure that I haven't put on here are things like what's the role of the organism? Is it a producer like a plant? Is it a consumer like a grazer? Or a predator that eats other animals? Or is it a decomposer, breaking down organic matter and returning nutrients to the soil? But there are also abiotic components to an ecosystem structure, things like landforms. So we just talked about the hills that define the different watersheds at Kanza Prairie. That's part of the abiotic components of the ecosystem structure. The climate helps determine what plants and animals can live in an area. So that's an abiotic component. And then there are abiotic disturbances, which we'll talk about on Wednesday. In this case, we're going to focus mostly on fire. So anything that's not living, but that influences the types of species and their abundances in a community. So all the things that make an ecosystem look the way it does, basically. Then we talk about function, we're usually going to be thinking about three things: productivity, how much biomass is being produced by the organisms that live in an environment, in an ecosystem; the flow of nutrients like carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus through the different organisms and that make up an ecosystem; and the flow of energy, right? The ultimate source of energy is the sun. We use the energy to make our bodies as organisms, and some of that energy is lost as heat ultimately. So how that energy moves through the system is part of the function of a community or an ecosystem. So what we're going to do, instead of going through all of this stuff, we're going to focus in on climate and how it relates to Kanza Prairie. We're going to focus in on some biotic interactions, grazers or organisms that are eating the grasses and forbs. And we're going to focus on fire as an abiotic factor that helps structure the Kanza Prairie ecosystem. So let's start with climate. This is a map, once again, showing the Great Plains region. And we've divided the prairies into three basic groups: shortgrass prairie, mixed grass, and tall grass prairie. What do you notice about the pattern of distribution of these three different kinds of prairies in North America?
They run from north to south, or vertically.
Yeah, there are these bands, right? Where it's short grass prairie to the west and tall grass prairie to the east. Why is this? Do either of these patterns look like they match pretty well with the distribution of different prairie types?
Precipitation windows.
Yeah, good. So when it comes to productivity, meaning the amount of biomass that plants produce using carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and energy from the sun, is very tightly related to the amount of water available to the plants. So what we see is a gradient of rainfall from dry in the west to wetter in the east that corresponds pretty well with sort of lower productivity shortgrass prairie versus higher productivity tallgrass prairie. And then further to the east, when you leave the prairie, you enter the eastern deciduous forest. And here in Kansas City, Missouri, we're kind of right on the boundary between tallgrass prairie and forest. It doesn't really show it that way, but if you zoom in on kind of a smaller scale, you'll see there's patches of prairie and patches of forest. They're kind of interfingering as you get into wetter and wetter climates where trees can take over. And probably 100 years ago, there was more prairie and less forest. The other gradient, though, is temperature. So you do, in fact, get cooler average temperatures as you move northward. So that's going to affect the timing of when things grow and when things flower in a prairie. So we can sort of overlay these two things and get a sense of why the prairie looks the way it does and when it greens up and when things grow. So why do we have these two gradients at all? Well, let's go really big picture now. Let's think about why there are seasons on Earth. So this is a little diagram showing the orbit of Earth around the sun. It takes obviously 1 year for the Earth to make a complete revolution around the sun. And during that time, it's revolving around its axis. And that axis around which Earth revolves every single day is tilted at about 23.5 degrees, as indicated here. It's this tilt of the Earth's axis relative to the incoming light from the sun that causes our seasons. Notice that over here on the right, when the southern hemisphere is facing sort of towards the sun and the axis of the Earth at the North Pole is tilted away from the sun, this is the southern hemisphere summertime. The southern hemisphere spends sort of more time receiving sunlight over the course of a day. The days are longer. And the most direct sort of incoming solar radiation is down here in the southern hemisphere below the equator. 6 months opposite from that, the Earth's axis is still tilted in the same direction. And if you're standing here if you go outside on a nice clear day and after the overcast passes, and you look up in the sky and you leave your camera shutter open and you start to see the stars making those circles around the sky, the only star that doesn't make a circle is Polaris, the North Star. So the axis of Earth is kind of pointing at this one far off star just by chance, and we call that Polaris, or the North Star. So notice that the axis is pointing the same direction in summer and in winter, but at this side, at the summer solstice, the northern hemisphere is tilted towards the sun. And then at the equinox, it's the equator that's close, that sort of has the sun directly overhead. The fact that we live on a sphere, or something very close to a sphere, also has a big influence on our climate. So as incoming radiation from the sun strikes near the equator, kind of between the Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn, anytime during the year, the energy of the sun is kind of most concentrated, it's most intense. Contrast that with, if you were up here in Alaska, this same amount of incoming solar radiation is spread out over a larger area as it intercepts the Earth at a shallower angle. So the angle of this yellow bar here to the Earth is almost 90 degrees, but up here, it's a much shallower angle. So that sunlight, because of that shallower angle of incidence, is spread out over a larger area. In addition to being spread out over a larger area, it has to travel through more atmosphere. So the atmosphere itself absorbs some of the energy that would ultimately make it to the ocean or to the ground and warm the surface of the Earth. And you also get a little bit of reflection. So as the sunlight hits the atmosphere, some of that is absorbed, some of that makes it through to the ground, and some of it bounces off. And you can see this is the same kind of thing that happens when you look at the surface of a pond or a body of water at a low angle. You can see the reflection of the sky because some of that light is bouncing off and not just going straight through into the water. The same principle applies here. I've got this term here, photon flux density. If you think of light as particles, photons, raining down on the surface of the Earth, they're coming in at a certain flux rate. There's some number of photons per unit time per square meter. And the density of the photon flux depends on sort of the angle at which the sunlight comes in. So this means that you get more energy per unit area towards the equator and less energy per unit area at the surface of the Earth at higher latitudes, up here or down here.
Note, so let me just say, this is a thing that I tried to correct when we were doing the introduction to the Galapagos. Note that it isn't because the equator is closer to the sun than the North Pole, because while that's absolutely true, the distance is so tiny relative to the distance of us from the sun that it is negligible. It's these other things, not the total distance from the sun. It's a common misconception that we see in first-year students. And those things that Dr. Judd just told you are the primary reasons, not the distance between the North Pole and the equator, because it's really just not that much distance.
That reminds me, another common misconception that I want to make sure nobody leaves this class with is the distance between the Earth and the sun varies just a little bit. It's not a perfect circle, but it turns out that the sort of widest part of our orbit, the widest part of the ellipse, is reached when we're in northern hemisphere summer. So that the time when the Earth is furthest from the sun is in fact the summer solstice. So that shows you that it's the angle that has a much bigger effect than either the radius of the Earth or the slight variations in exactly how far the Earth is from the sun. And you can demonstrate this to yourself if you are at a socially distanced fireside sometime this holiday. Feel that the side of you that's facing the fire is going to get the most energy, and the side of you that's kind of sort of at the edge, right, that transition, is going to have less energy because of that shallower angle. And if you take a half a step forward or half a step back, you won't notice much difference. But going from your nose to your ear as you stare at the fire, you'll notice a big difference in temperature. Okay, is this going to play? Let me see if this plays. Yeah, okay, good. So this is an animation showing the consequence of seasonal changes as the Earth revolves around the sun on its axis, combined with the fact that most of Earth's land area is in the northern hemisphere. So this is an animation showing seasonal changes from green to white in the northern hemisphere over the course of a year. This, what you're looking at right now, is northern hemisphere summer. So notice the forests of Canada and Eurasia are nice and green. And that at equivalent latitudes, so across here where we have southern Alaska, Canada, most of Russia, at equivalent latitudes in the southern hemisphere, it's mostly ocean. And we'll talk about the effect of water on climate in just a moment. But let's see if we can get this animation to play. Now we're going into full summer, the warmest part of the year, August, that sort of thing, and then winter returns. So now the highest energy input is in the southern hemisphere. Parts of southern Brazil and northern Argentina are getting a lot of energy, and it's nice cold winter up in Canada and much of Eurasia. See if we can watch this one more time. There we are getting into summer. Lots of energy in the northern hemisphere coming in. Getting towards past the equinox, and now most of the energy is coming in around the Tropic of
Can I just add something?
Yep.
Yeah, when you run this animation, if you download this in PowerPoint and run this animation, it's split into two sections. The first section is the first 6 months of the year, and then the second section is the last 6 months of the year. And you'll notice that in July and August, the retreat of ice continues to happen before it then starts to come back. And that's because the Earth builds up heat over time. And so the Earth has this thermal mass. And so changes in solar energy input don't necessarily translate into changes in temperature immediately, especially at the end of the summer where you've built up all this heat in the northern hemisphere. That it takes it a couple of months for that heat to then dissipate. The longest day of the year is June 22nd, but you're still gaining heat. You're still registering this heat in the northern hemisphere into July and August because of just the thermal mass of the Earth.
Yeah, and the converse of that is it feels like you're in the depths of winter in January and February, but in fact, over most of winter, the days are getting longer. It's just the Earth is slow to warm back up, or at least the northern hemisphere is slow to warm back up.
Yeah, it just takes time for a mass this big to heat up and cool down.
Okay. So during the equinox, when the equator is the region of the Earth that's receiving the most direct sunlight, you get the formation of an atmospheric circulation pattern that we'll start with as the Intertropical convergence zone. So what's happening here is that the most solar energy is coming in at the equator, and that's causing a lot of water to evaporate, and the atmosphere is quite warm, so it can hold a lot of water, and that warm, wet air rises because hot air rises. As it does, it gets higher and higher in altitude, it cools because you're colder as you get at higher altitudes. So then that warm, moist air condenses and you get rain. So this belt of high rainfall in the tropics is called the Intertropical convergence zone because as this air rises and the rain falls out, the air is replaced from the north and from the south by more air that can then be warmed and heated. So you get the formation of these cycles where this cool, dry air that rose and rained out spreads to the north and to the south and is replaced from below by more air that is warmed. And you get these cells. The outer portion of the cells, where the air falls back down at about 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south, this is where you've got air that's lost its moisture, so it's dry, and it's been at high altitude, so it's cooled down. So then this cool, dry air descends, and that's what comes in and replaces the rising moist air here. These cells are called Hadley cells, and it helps set up a really important component of global atmospheric circulation patterns. It's also why we get wet tropical rainforests in the tropics. Now, over the course of the year, as Earth's position and its axis changes relative to the sun, the position of that Intertropical convergence zone shifts south and shifts north. This is a little bit exaggerated, depends on kind of where you are in the world, but it shifts north and south depending on exactly which portion of the Earth is facing the sun most directly. this is kind of a confusing diagram because I just showed you that it's the tilt of the Earth that determines the seasons. So the sun isn't shifting like this, right? It's the Earth's axis that makes it appear the sun is overhead in the southern hemisphere or overhead in the northern hemisphere. A lot of diagrams that you'll see will sort of organize things like this. So those Hadley cells, why are they so important? Well, they help set up a series of these atmospheric circulation cells that go from the equator to the North Pole and also to the South Pole. So here's that rising, warm, moist air creating rainfall in the tropics, setting up this Hadley cell with cool, dry air descending around 30 degrees north and also 30 degrees south. This descending dry air kind of sets up a second cell, partly because of drag, atmospheric drag. This mid-latitude cell called a Ferrel cell is the atmospheric circulation pattern that's set up between about 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south and 60 north and 60 south. You get this descending cool dry air and it flows then north and then rises again as it's picked up moisture from the surface of the Earth, and it's been warmed closer to the surface of the Earth such that you get storms again that sweep through. So a lot of our thunderstorms that we get in this part of the country have to do with the position of the Ferrel cell. And finally, there's a polar cell. This is the atmospheric circulation at the high latitudes of the Earth that brings in that cool polar air south and gives us our really cold winters. The other term that's on here that I didn't define is called the tropopause. This is just kind of this boundary between the troposphere, the lowest layer of the atmosphere where our weather and clouds mostly form, and the next layer up, the stratosphere, which is up basically above the red line. It's the troposphere below the tropopause where most of our weather is determined. So once again, the Earth is not flat. We're going from equator to North Pole. Let's think about this in 3 dimensions, including that axis. So this is our little depiction of the Earth. It's rotating such that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. You've got these Hadley cells that form on either side of the intertropical convergence zone. Then these mid-latitude or Ferrel cells, and then the polar cells at the north and the south. Now, you've got this cyclical changes in the altitude of the atmosphere, or atmospheric circulation as it rises and as the air rises and falls. But then on top of that, the Earth is rotating. Because it's rotating, you get this deflection of air as it moves from the, as the air moves along the surface of the Earth and the Earth rotates, you get this deflection pattern that we call the Coriolis effect. Notice that in the Northern Hemisphere, if you're moving from this 30-degree belt, where we have most of the world's deserts, south towards the equator, so towards the equator, the arrows are deflected to the right. Similarly, if you're here at the 30 degrees and you start going north towards the pole, the arrows are deflected to the right again. And in the polar cell, as you go from the North Pole down to about 60 degrees, going down, or going south, I should say, going south, the arrows are again deflected to the right. And the opposite is true in the Southern Hemisphere. As you go from 30 south to the equator, the arrows are deflected to the left. This is a consequence of the Earth rotating and creating these wind patterns underneath these atmospheric circulation cells called the Hadley cells and Ferrel cells and polar cells. I think based on how things went last time, I think I'm going to put together a little screencast on this Coriolis effect for you all, and I'll post that on Moodle here in the next day or two. Okay, climate diagrams. These are Walter Leith climate diagrams, and their purpose is to show you annual or yearly fluctuations in rainfall and in temperature. Those two things tell you a lot about the climate of a region, and they determine to a large extent, the kinds of plants that can grow in an area. And what we've got here is a diagram showing the temperature and the rainfall in California, where you have a long, dry summer and a wet winter. We've got, let's see, Philadelphia, where there's a lot more rainfall. You never have this deficit that's indicated by yellow in California. And then there's these cold winters where the average temperature is around 0 centigrade, and the warm summers where the average temperature is maybe 25 centigrade. Versus Brazil, where you're right here, basically on the equator. Notice the temperature is pretty much constant year round, but there's a distinct wet season, shown here by the dark blue, and a dry season, or reasonably dry season. This is because as the Earth orbits the sun, that intertropical convergence zone shifts north and south just a little bit. So here in the dark blue, it's under that ITCZ, and here in the light blue, it's not directly under the convergence zone, so you get more of a dry season. This is what the diagram looks like for Manhattan, Kansas, where Konza Prairie is. These things are always set up so that 100 millimeters of rainfall matches up with 50 degrees centigrade. And that has to do with how plants use water. That's part of the reason they chose to line these two axes up the same way, such that if you're here, you're in a water surplus. If the blue goes below the red, you're in a water deficit. And in this region here, there's enough water for plant growth and not being oversaturated. Notice that there are dry winters and wet summers, hot summers, cool winters. A typical continental climate where we have hot, wet summers and cool, dry winters. That pattern is typical of most grasslands of the world. So this is everything in blue here is what we call a continental climate, which is exactly what I just said, cold, dry winters and warm, wet summers. And this is where we are in Kansas. The other thing that characterizes continental climates, besides that general pattern, is high variability from one year to another. So this shows the annual precipitation for Manhattan, Kansas over 100 years or so. Notice that there are some very wet years and there are some very dry years here. The shape of the curve that we saw in the Walter Lathe diagram is an average across all of this. But notice that you have very wet years and very dry years. The fact that you can get very dry years became really important during the Dust Bowl, when farmers started, when European settlers started farming at more and more intense, they started farming larger and larger areas, I should say. And they would use tilling as a means to access the nutrients of the soil and support the growth of crops. And tilling just means churning up the soil so that it's fresh, organic rich, and moist so that crops grow really well. The other thing that tilling does is it exposes all that soil such that if it dries out, it can blow away as dust. So a combination of tilling, breaking up the roots and breaking up the plants that bound the soil together, combined with some really dry years, led to basically the soil blowing away and forming these enormous dust storms that forced a lot of people to give up their farms and move to California or wherever else they moved during the 1820s. So that's what caused the Dust Bowl, a combination of tilling and dry climate that blew away the soil. Okay, we're going to talk next time. We'll finish up our discussion of bison, and I will ask you guys to share a little bit of what you learned from your homework assignment. But these are probably the most important native grazers at Konza Prairie. Once again, notice the Flint Hills with the flat horizons and these dissected valleys with more moisture means more trees in the valleys. Bison are not nearly as abundant as they once were. Historically, bison were found throughout North America. Even this range that's highlighted as original is a bit conservative, but they were found pretty much everywhere and were very quickly hunted almost to extinction over the course of several decades in the mid to late 1800s. So you can see there were only a few patches where native bison herds were still thriving. In many places, the bison population is increasing. People are starting to farm them and manage them. So we're not at the edge, we're not near extinction with bison anymore, but there's no bison here in Missouri, right? Or there's very few. So you can see that a major component of the ecosystem, one of the most important and most dense consumers of plant material in the Great Plains, was reduced in abundance dramatically over the course of several decades. Let's see. We're going to start, I think, with these questions, and we'll do them in little breakout groups next time. So I'm going to skip ahead to one more slide to show you guys what a bison wallow is. Anyone find out what a bison wallow is during your homework? Did anyone see them in Google Earth?
Isn't that just where the bisons kind of like roll around and basically just like tear up the ground?
Yeah, they make these wallows to have dust baths. And you can see they can be quite large. And here's the bison rolling around in the dirt with a baby. That's exactly what it is. It's a place where they remove all the vegetation, kind of disturb that little patch of ground, and they'll use it for a while and then leave it. And gradually the vegetation, the plants will recolonize this and rebuild the soil and take over again. So this is one of the many behaviors that bison have that influence the plant communities at Konza Prairie.
It also influences amphibian communities because amphibians will breed in these little depressions. So oftentimes we talk about organisms that we call ecosystem engineers, organisms that have these really big structural impacts on ecosystems and then influence the diversity and abundance of a lot of other kinds of organisms through their actions. And so you would consider bison one of these because these kinds of disturbances affect not only the plant community, they affect the amphibian community by providing breeding habitat, et cetera.
Yeah, that's a good point. How many of you have heard of keystone species? Anyone heard of keystone?
I have.
Well, I just wanted to point out that you'll hear different terms. You'll hear about keystone species, you'll hear about ecosystem engineers, and you'll hear about dominant species. And they all have a slightly different meaning, but they all provide a lot of, they provide some of the structure that characterizes different ecosystems. They influence the diversity and abundance of other species in the community in slightly different ways. So I'll break those three down for you guys in the lecture when we pick it up next time. Let's see. I feel like this is kind of a good break point because I want to start with those discussion questions at the beginning of class next time. So does anyone have any questions on what we've covered today about Earth's climate? Again, I'll post a screencast for the Coriolis effect.
I have one more announcement if there are no questions.
All yours.
On Moodle, there is an assignment for the ANOVA. It's a small data set on tick sizes on different hosts. It's up there, work through it, and there is an assignment tab, an assignment link on Moodle so you can submit that. Don't do this in R, do this by hand so that you'll learn the procedure by which an ANOVA operates. Do Wednesday at the end of the day.
Small group. discussion. Okay, yeah, we will start next time with a small group discussion. So make sure you have your homework that was due today, and look for announcements about lab and upcoming lectures.
All right, see you guys.
See ya.